No Small Endeavor is brought to you by Progressive Insurance. What if comparing car insurance rates was as easy as putting on your favorite podcast? With Progressive, it is. Just visit the Progressive website to quote with all the coverages you want. You'll see Progressive's direct rate, then their tool will provide options from other companies so you can compare. All you need to do is choose the rate and coverage you like. Quote today at Progressive.com to join the over 28 million drivers who trust Progressive. Progressive Casualty Insurance Company and Affiliates. Comparison rates not available in all states or situations. Prices vary based on how you buy.
Ever wondered how artificial intelligence or 3D printing is used to solve medical problems? Or how medical research is discovering new ways to slow or stop medical conditions we used to think of as untreatable? Listen to Tomorrow's Cure, where host Kathy Werzer interviews experts from Mayo Clinic and other renowned organizations, such as Cleveland Clinic, Johns Hopkins Hospital, or the Veteran Health Administration. Get a glimpse into these brilliant minds as they share how they use innovative thinking in their pursuit of answers for patients. What they describe may sound futuristic, but listen and you will find out. Tomorrow's Cure is already here. Find Tomorrow's Cure wherever you get your podcasts.
I'm Lee C. Camp, and this is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life.
All of the founders thought that we could not govern ourselves as a democracy unless we first achieved self-government as individuals.
That's Jeffrey Rosen, law professor at George Washington University, president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, and host of the We the People podcast. Rosen insists that many of the founders of the United States devoted much of their personal and political effort to something egregiously missing in today's political discourse: the necessity of virtue.
In many ways, we're living in the founders' nightmare. They warned of demagogues, of rule by passion rather than reason, of the need to check our immediate and lowest impulses, and a world of social media and political polarization in many ways seems to be the opposite.
All coming right up. Hey friends, if you like listening to stories that teach you something, then I have a great podcast recommendation for you, Cautionary Tales, the chart-topping history podcast from Pushkin. We've all heard the saying, learn from your mistakes, but couldn't the same be true for other people's mistakes? On Cautionary Tales, you hear a treasure trove of mishaps and meltdowns that teach us all something. Each episode, Financial Times columnist Tim Harford mines the greatest fiascos of the past for their most valuable lessons. Some stories may delight you, others may scare you, but they'll all make you wiser. Like, how did efforts to control the weather go disastrously awry? Or, what's the connection between the medieval dancing plague and Havana syndrome? That and more. Don't miss out. Listen to Cautionary Tales wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Lee C. Camp. This is No Small Endeavor, exploring what it means to live a good life. As the United States celebrates Independence Day, celebrating freedom and the pursuit of happiness, we pause to ask a few questions about basics. Namely, what is freedom and what is the pursuit of happiness? One common interpretation of the pursuit of happiness is that this phrase was a euphemism for the right to acquire and hold private property. This view could then come fully flowered in a vision of 21st century American consumerism. We have a right of freedom to pursue a life of acquisition and consumption, and this will make us happy. I often tell my students that many of the ancients would have found such a view of freedom and its attendant view of happiness as sheer madness. They would have insisted that this is not freedom, but in fact is a form of slavery, a true bondage. True freedom, many insisted, was not the right to do what one wants, but was first to learn to want what is good, and then have the capacity to practice what is good. And more, they insisted that it was only this kind of freedom that could make for a happy life. These are obviously two profoundly different visions of freedom and happiness, and our guest today, Jeffrey Rosen, argues that when the founders used the phrase pursuit of happiness, they did not mean what we commonly assume it means, but that they assumed what many of the ancients assumed, that the pursuit of happiness is the pursuit of goodness, the pursuit of virtue, and that a democratic republic could not possibly survive apart from a citizenry schooled in this much older vision of freedom and happiness. Rosen, happily to me, does not make his argument in service to some sort of moralistic tale that overlooks the grave and egregious challenges that were at the heart of the American founding.
They fell short on so many levels, including most notoriously slavery.
Instead, his account invites us to grapple anew with the meaning of happiness, with the meaning of freedom. So this might be one of the most important conversations you could have over your beer and hot dogs or your tofu burger and fireworks this Independence Day. Enjoy. Jeffrey Rosen is the president and CEO of the National Constitution Center, where he hosts We the People, a weekly podcast of constitutional debate. He's also a professor of law at the George Washington University Law School and a contributing editor of The Atlantic. He was previously the legal affairs editor of the New Republic and a staff writer for The New Yorker. He's a graduate of Harvard College, Oxford University, where he was a Marshall Scholar, and Yale Law School. His new book, which we're discussing today, is The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. Welcome, Jeff.
Great to be with you.
Grateful to have you with us today. Typically, after I read a guest's book, I always come away with one or two books that I want to buy. But with your book, I've already bought one book that's on the way, and I've got a list of about 8 more that I feel like I just must go out and buy, and another 4 or 5 I've got to pull off my bookshelf from grad school days. So it's a very compelling read. Thank you for the great book.
Wonderful. What was the first book you bought?
I can't even remember the name of it, but it was the one that Frederick Douglass purchased when he was a young man.
Superb. The Columbian Orator, the most meaningful compilation in Frederick Douglass's life. It also transformed Abraham Lincoln's life. It's this golden book, and it's so moving to think of the fact that Douglass had to buy it on the streets of Baltimore with bread, and he had to use bread to get boys to teach him how to read because his wicked master had forbade him from learning to read. The great Douglass historian David Blight has a edition of the Columbian Orator out, which talks about its huge significance in the 19th century. And it's just an affirmation of how a single book can completely change our lives.
Yeah, it's a remarkable story. And I had never heard of the book. And so I'm excited about getting it and working through it. Another kind of introductory comment I'd like to make is that I think seldom these days do we find a book making a compelling case for the necessary task of doing moral philosophy. And you do that in a compelling way. So from someone from that discipline, I'm pretty excited about that as well. And I thank you for that.
Oh, I'm delighted that it was meaningful for you.
I think we want to begin in a place that might be counterintuitive for a lot of folks. And that is the definition of happiness. And you're pointing us to happiness as a state or a pursuit of goodness. So kind of unpack that for us a little bit and perhaps contrast it to how we might think about it today.
For much of human history, for the founding generation, and for classical moral philosophers, happiness meant not feeling good, but being good. Not the pursuit of pleasure, but the pursuit of virtue. And by the pursuit of virtue, they had in mind self-improvement, character improvement, self-regulation, using our powers of reason to master our unreasonable passions and emotions so that we can achieve the virtues of the soul, including the classical virtues: temperance, prudence, courage, and justice. It's really striking how pervasive this eudaimonic definition of happiness was for much of human history and how dramatically we've lost it.
Yeah, and then as you play out through a large part of your book, this classical definition and understanding of happiness ought to be understood with the founders' use of the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. And of course, many contemporary interpreters have assumed that pursuit of happiness means, or could be translated, pursuit of property. But you're arguing, no, actually, in contrast, it's this classical understanding of happiness that they're pointing to.
It's just striking how this truth, this self-evident truth, is hiding in plain sight. I read all the books on Thomas Jefferson's reading list that he said inspired his understanding of the pursuit of happiness. He listed them in his moral philosophy section. And all of them contain the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, and all define it as virtue rather than seeking pleasure. Property was omitted for a technical reason. Jefferson admires Locke as one of the 3 greatest men of the age. Locke and Isaac Newton and Francis Bacon are hanging in his dining room because he admires them so much. In the second treatise, Locke talks about our natural rights of life, liberty, and property. Why did Jefferson leave out property? Because Property, unlike happiness, is an alienable rather than an unalienable natural right. When we found governments, we surrendered to government the power to regulate property to get greater security of the property we've retained. And obviously, property itself can be alienated or surrendered to government. By contrast, the pursuit of happiness is rooted in our freedom of conscience, which is rooted in our powers of reason. And I can't alienate or surrender to you my powers of reason because it's a God-given attribute that is inherent in who I am as a human being. So that's why not just Jefferson, because he, as he said, was just channeling the popular understanding. All of the sources that he relied on talk about happiness as an unalienable right, and that's why he put it in the Declaration.
The phrase pursuit of happiness, another significant phrase there that you play out in the book and show in so many of the biographical sketches of the founders, that it's truly a pursuit, a lifelong process, and that the happiness is there as much in the pursuit as in the acquisition of some given state. And also the fact that in these pursuits, they often fail. They often do poorly or get back up again and keep on trying. But unpack for us a bit how the emphasis upon pursuit of happiness is crucial in the storytelling that you're doing.
Cicero talks about happiness being a quest whose satisfactions come not in obtaining, but in the pursuit itself. And that's because the pursuit is of moral perfection. And by definition, we will never, in fact, be morally perfect. Only Socrates and Jesus and a handful of the greatest sages in history can approach that ideal. But we can try daily through the cultivation of daily habits. One of the inspiration for this classical understanding was Pythagoras, another great sage, who insisted that through rigorous daily self-accounting of our efforts to become more perfect, we could, as Pythagoras said, first be good and then like gods. That was the classical understanding. So by definition, you're never going to obtain perfection, but by daily, hourly labor, you can try to become more perfect.
Benjamin Franklin figures in your first biographical sketch, one of the classic examples of someone who took very seriously this daily accounting. What did you learn about Franklin's pursuit?
It was Franklin's effort to achieve moral perfection that really inspired the whole book. In his early 20s, Franklin resolved to achieve moral perfection by creating a Pythagorean system of moral accounting, where he made a list of 13 virtues, and then every week would focus on a different virtue and put an X mark when he'd fallen short. He tried this for a while and found it very depressing because there were so many X marks, and then he gave it up. As I mentioned in the book, I tried the Franklin system with a friend, improbably at the recommendation of a rabbi. Franklin's system had been translated into Hebrew in the 19th century by a Hasidic rabbi who viewed it as a foundation of the Jewish school of Musar, or character improvement. And a friend and I tried the Franklin system. We also found it incredibly depressing. And we also gave it up, but also, like Franklin, thought that we were better for having tried. Just being mindful about your conduct, your thoughts, your actions is a really useful thing. For Franklin, this virtue project was the definition of the pursuit of happiness, and Franklin had translated works by the preachers Wollaston and Tillotson in the 1750s that contained the phrase, the pursuit of happiness. Franklin was a great champion of Samuel Johnson, the American, not the British, preacher, who defined the pursuit of happiness and wrote the leading moral philosophy textbook that was used in more American schools than any other. So what was really striking for me was to see the deep connection between Franklin's efforts at moral perfection and the Declaration of Independence.
I think that reading Franklin, the line that you have from him again, where he says, "I conceived the bold and arduous project of arriving at moral perfection." It is bold, and it seems at one level almost laughable that one should set such a goal. But on the other hand, how many of us aspire to such taking our lives seriously and the project of trying to grow into such a human being? What do you make of that lofty vision for one's life?
It's really inspiring and so striking that it was commonplace throughout the founding generation. It wasn't just Franklin and Adams and the famous founders who took this quest so seriously and considered it not just a right, but a moral duty. It was installed in school kids through books like The Columbian Orator. It inspired women who didn't have access to classical education, like the great Abigail Adams and Mercy Otis Warren, and the first enslaved poet, Phyllis Wheatley, who became an international celebrity because of her great poetry. It was a central part of the moral education of kids of all ages and backgrounds for most of American history. Isn't that really surprising that was the goal was no less than daily work toward moral perfection, and that was what every school kid was supposed to strive for?
One of the key constructs in moral formation is self-regulation, the conflict or the tension or the dialogue, we might say, between reason and passion. How does that play out in a lot of the founders?
As you say, it's the self-regulation is the central task. The conflict between reason and passion is central. And reason and passion are like secret keys that unlock the founders' entire conception, not only of personal self-government, but also political self-government. I came to see the Federalist Papers in an entirely new light. In his famous definition of faction, Madison in Federalist 10 defines a faction as any group, a majority or a minority, animated by passion rather than reason, devoted to self-interest rather than the public good. And he and Hamilton and Washington and all of the founders thought that we could not govern ourselves as a democracy unless we first achieved self-government as individuals. And the way to do that was by using our powers of reason to master our unreasonable passions and emotions so that we could achieve the calm tranquility, moderation, temperance, and prudence that defined virtue. Of course, there were all sorts of important philosophical and theological debates about the balance between reason and passion. David Hume notoriously said that reason is and ought to be the slave of passion, and thought it was unrealistic to regulate fully. Others thought that with the aid of a hardwired moral sense, we might be able to achieve that balance. But although philosophers and theologians disagreed about precisely how to balance reason and passion, all agreed that that was the central task, that self-regulation was the goal, and that virtue would be the result.
You're listening to No Small Endeavor and our conversation with Jeffrey Rosen. I love hearing from you. Tell us what you're reading, who you're paying attention to, or send us feedback about today's episode. You can reach me at lee@nosmallendeavor.com. You can get show notes for this episode in your podcast app or wherever you listen. These notes include links to resources mentioned in this episode, as well as a PDF of my complete interview notes and a full transcript. We would be delighted if you'd tell your friends about No Small Endeavor and invite them to join us on the podcast, because it helps extend the reach of the beauty, truth, and goodness we are seeking to sow in the world. Coming up, Jeffrey discusses the role Stoicism played in many of the founders' philosophy, the necessity of learning to self-govern one's emotions and passions, and what hope there might be in an age of political polarization and instant gratification.
Hey there, I'm Dr. Maya Shankar, and I'm a scientist who studies human behavior. Many of us have experienced a moment in our lives that changes everything, that instantly divides our life into a before and an after. On my podcast, A Slight Change of Plans, I talk to people about navigating these moments. Their stories are full of candor and hard-won wisdom. And you'll hear from scientists who teach us how we can be more resilient in the face of change. Listen on the iHeartRadio app, Apple Podcasts, or wherever you get your podcasts.
So Stoicism plays a key role in the text that a lot of the founders are reading. For those who might be unfamiliar, unpack some of the key constructs there.
One basic Stoic notion comes from Epictetus, the dichotomy of control. Focus on the only thing that you can control, which are your own thoughts and emotions and actions, and not the thoughts and emotions and actions of others. And by focusing on mastering yourself, you achieve complete freedom, because it's the only thing that we actually do have under our control. That idea of affecting our own reality through the power of the imagination is shared by Eastern and Western wisdom traditions. We are what we think, life shaped by the mind, said the Dhammapada. it puts tremendous emphasis on individual opportunity and responsibility, because in the end, our reality is the result of the way that we view what happens to us, not objectively. In other words, even in the face of the greatest tragedy of the loss of our worldly wealth or the death of a loved one, our decision about how to view that catastrophe is entirely up to us. And by viewing things realistically, the Stoics in their most rigorous form said that even grief could be overcome, and we could be grateful for the happy times we'd shared with our departed loved ones and recognize that everything is as it's supposed to be. There's no point in willing things are otherwise than they are. And we can move forward from there. For many, the Stoic injunction of completely overcoming grief was unrealistic. Abigail Adams, who styled herself Portia after the Roman figure, thought that it was too much to expect that she could ever not be sad if something bad happened to John Adams. And there were debates about whether the Epicureans, who, far from being heedless pleasure seekers, as they were caricatured as being, thought that we should, rather than totally trying to overcome desires, should rationally contract our desires so that we could meet them. And Jefferson, who'd started off as an acolyte of Cicero at the end of his life, declared himself to be an Epicurean in trying to rationally contract desires. But the core of Stoicism is incredibly self-empowering, which is why so many people are finding it meaningful today. And of course, a great place to begin if you want to start with Stoicism is Marcus Aurelius.
Just yesterday, my wife and I were having a conversation. We started laughing about, well, there's the dichotomy of control, and we can focus on what we can do something about, which I find immensely helpful. And of course, the old Serenity Prayer by Reinhold Niebuhr, I think, is a kind of classic American formulation of that. God grant me the serenity to accept the things I cannot change, the courage to change the things I can, and the wisdom to know the difference. I do think as well, what you pointed to there with Abigail Adams, for example, I think I myself find the extremes overdone in the sense that I suspect that grief or even things like fear or anger might be emotions that are best not fully detached from, but seeing how they might inform us or teach us or help us grow in deeper maturation. Thoughts on that or further commentary on that?
Yes, so much wisdom suggests that we grow most from adversity, and far from entirely denying grief, realistically confronting it and nerving our determination to learn from it can be extremely productive. The real goal of the dichotomy of control is to prevent us from distracting ourselves with unproductive perseveration about stuff that we can't control, anxiously speculating about worst case scenarios in the future, or obsessively perseverating about what we could have done differently in the past is not productive. And reframing our perspective so that we focus on what we can control in the here and now can be very empowering. At the same time, it may not be healthy or realistic to deny the tremendous sadness and sorrow that can come from tragedy, from broken relationships, from bad choices, and learning from those choices and those tragedies rather than denying them can also be empowering.
Yeah, thank you for that. I think that simple question of, is this emotion useful, is itself a very useful observation. You know, when I'm ruminating about some given emotion or feeling, simply asking myself that question, is this a useful use of my energy or not? And if it's not, then trying to find a way to let it go and focus on things that can be helpful.
That's an excellent question, if I may. Is this a useful emotion? I was so struck by advice that Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg told me that her mom had given her, which completely shaped her life. Overcome unproductive emotions like anger, jealousy, and fear. They are not productive and they'll distract you from useful work, Justice Ginsburg's mother told her. And that's the core of the Stoic wisdom. Not that we overcome all emotion, far from it, but just that we overcome unproductive emotion. And anger is, in particular, anger, jealousy, fear are not productive. So we can reframe things so that we can see things realistically and move forward in a productive way.
What do you think of, it seems like there's an important nuance here that we're kind of circling around that I just would like to take a moment to try to see if we can articulate. Aristotle has that famous line about the virtuous human being or man for him, but the virtuous man will be angry about the right things in the right way for the right length of time with the right intensity. He seems to be acknowledging that anger has its place, but it's very circumscribed. If one is going to be angry, it's only in a very careful way. Even with something like fear, with his definition of courage and his definition of virtues as a golden mean between two vices, one of excess, one of deficiency. So for him, fear actually might be very productive in the sense that one who has insufficient attention to fear might end up being reckless, whereas someone who is too beholden to fear might be a coward. And so again, I think it's fascinating kind of nuance about how we frame these things that can kind of inform the way we approach processing our emotions and then what we do with them as potential forms of information to us. But follow up or thoughts on that?
Absolutely. As you say, Aristotle is very precise about this, and his famous overview of the moral virtues and vices in the Nicomachean Ethics has, as you suggest, a virtue and vices, and the vices can be excesses or deficiencies. So if the virtue is courage, the vice can be cowardice is the deficiency and recklessness is the excess. These balances are not intuitive, and of course they're hard to translate, but they show the tremendous nuance of finding a balance between excesses and deficiencies. Moderation is the virtue, licentiousness is the excess, and insensibility is the deficiency. Friendliness is the virtue, obsequiousness or flattery the excess, surliness or quarrelsomeness the deficiency. It reminds us that emotions are extraordinarily nuanced, complicated things. Under the right circumstances, mindful, justified anger can be necessary to achieve both courage, to nerve ourselves against fear, and also justice, to avenge serious wrongs. But it has to be self-controlled. It can never be just the unregulated expression of immediate impulse. It has to be well thought out.
It strikes me as well that the way you're framing this conversation from the founders gives us a much more helpful way to think about vices, not as arbitrary constraints upon an otherwise legitimate pleasure, but instead habits that can lead us to destruction, right?
It's a crucial point. Take the vice that I find myself confronting every moment of the day, which is the urge to browse, just to idly scroll newspapers or the web and gratify my immediate impulse just to lazily scan the news, as opposed to reading. During COVID, this habit of setting aside the mornings for actually reading books rather than browsing changed my life. It's a radical transformation in my habits. And I find after I've done an hour of deep reading as opposed to an hour of idle browsing, I actually feel better. I feel productive. I feel like I've made something of the day, regardless of what happens after that. But I've had to resist the immediate urge to gratify the easy impulse, which is just to browse, to buckle down, think twice, and to read. And that's why welfare hedonists, which is a fancy term for some really thoughtful moral philosophers today, say that resisting immediate impulses actually can lead to long-term well-being, that being good can make us also feel good. But the only way to do that is to regulate in the moment and to resist immediate impulse gratification.
Yeah, I find that observation quite helpful, which also is another way of nuancing where we started earlier about kind of the happiness as, on the one hand, seen as a pursuit of being good versus a pursuit of feeling good. And those that you just pointed to would say, well, again, nuance would say that it is about both goodness and feeling together, but rightfully construed, right? I'll tell my students that one way to think about the virtue of temperance is not a suggestion that you should not enjoy pleasures, but instead actually is suggesting how you can better enjoy pleasures with greater depth or greater longevity or whatever the case may be. But it's about enjoying well.
Precisely. Enjoying well and enjoying better are a great way to put it. the pleasures are more enduring. Samuel Johnson, the British, not the American moral philosopher, said, "The pleasures of sudden wonder are soon exhausted, and the mind can only repose in the stability of truth." Wonderful Johnsonian aphorism, and it's true.
It was surprising to me of how many of a particular set of daily habits and practices showed up in so many of the founders. And so I'd like to kind of talk through some of these. One being time management and industriousness. Where do you see these in some of the founders, and what's that look like?
It's the most persistent virtue that they achieved. They fell short on so many levels, including most notoriously slavery, which we can talk about, but they were industrious until the end. And it's so moving to see John Adams and Thomas Jefferson as old men, having set aside the strife of the world and reconciled after their political battles, keeping up the same rigorous reading and writing schedules that they had as kids, and excitedly trading ideas for books and spending hours each day on their reading and their correspondence. Old habits die hard is quite true. And having spent time ever since he was a kid getting up before sunrise and reading deeply, Jefferson kept that up until the end of his life. Washington was especially moved by Seneca on time, and Seneca's great essay on time. Time is a gift repaid by industry, by squandering it. What fools these mortals be, and the famous phrase that Shakespeare quoted in Midsummer Night's Dream, inspired Washington to live a life centered around clocks. And he had clocks everywhere and started his meals at the same time and was just really careful in keeping to his schedule. It's really just changing our awareness of time and being mindful of each moment and recognizing that squandering time is sinful, because time is all we can control, and it's so precious and it's so fleeting, and being in the moment and using every moment productively, for me, was the biggest takeaway of the classical wisdom.
Exercise too, which was one that quite surprised me from them.
Yes, Jefferson has all sorts of advice, both about the importance of daily exercise, horseback riding and hiking, and what you should do while you're hiking. He says, don't take books with you on hikes, but engage in close observation of nature and be really attentive about what you're seeing. It gets you out of your head, out of your ego-based thoughts, so you can connect to the divine. And they're getting this from many, including Pythagoras, who was really a self-help guru in addition to inventing the triangle and the harmonic system, insisted on rigorous moderation in eat and drink. He was a vegetarian, with the exception of beans, which was a peculiar exception he had, and just emphasized that to reverence thyself, which was his great motto, reverence thyself, you have to treat the body as a temple and make it as perfect as the soul.
We're going to take a short break, but coming right up, some helpful methods of virtue-based self-examination, why such self-examination is necessary at all, and signs of hope in an age of political polarization and instant gratification. Hey there! Did you know that we have a newsletter? Just imagine if you could have one of your favorite ethics professors send you a list of things to reflect on, think about, practical actions with which to experiment, all on your way to sorting through what it might mean to live a good life. Well, that is the NSC Notebook. I riff on themes and topics related to the show and our guests. Sign up for my NSC Notebook today at nosmallendeavor.com/newsletter. You've already alluded to daily self-examination with Franklin, but what are some of the particulars of what this looked like for other folks?
Well, John and Abigail Adams used it as a dating strategy. Adams had read Pythagoras, and Adams said, I've got a good idea. Let's make a list of each other's faults. We'll engage in self-accounting on each other, which I really don't recommend when you're just starting off.
I can't hardly imagine, yes.
Totally. But they did it, and of course, they were brutally honest, and Abigail is much more generous. She says to John, well, some people might think you're a little intimidating, but that's only because you're so brilliant. And, and then Adam says, well, you should practice the piano more and spend more time reading, and plus you're pigeon-toed. And Abigail said, well, I try to practice the piano more, but a gentleman should never comment on a lady's posture. So she is much more self-possessed. But they thought it was a responsibility. And Abigail is constantly exhorting John Quincy Adams, master your passions, use your time well, you're squandering every moment. And it created in him this incredible self-reproach. I love that letter. He's in his 20s and he's just turned down a Supreme Court appointment and he's minister to Russia. And he says, I'm 27 years old. I haven't achieved anything with my life. I'm spending too much time with the theater. I'm drinking too much. I mean, the combination of the classical and the Puritan work ethic, he was just incredibly hard on himself. But look at all he achieved as a result. If he perhaps came closer to the ideal of moral perfection than any else in his generation.
A quick parenthetical follow-up question on that. Are you aware of anyone who's done a study or a book essay on looking at different modes of doing daily self-examination?
That is such an interesting topic. And no, I'm not. Have you come across anything like it?
I haven't, no. The question just arose as I was reading your book and wondering, I've tried different ways and I have particular ways of journaling. But in hearing the description of some of the journaling and some of the characters you discuss, I thought, it would be interesting to see what different ways people have tried to journal or give an account or keep track of their experiments in moral formation. But I've not seen that. Maybe we've sorted out a book that needs to be written.
Absolutely. Would love to see it. And, the Franklin system is one effort. Well, I guess I do know the book. And that would be the John Locke book on education that Franklin kind of cribbed his system from. Not the system itself, which he got from Pythagoras, but the Locke on education was the motto for the junto, or the club that Franklin set up to create a united party of virtue. And I do think that Locke has a kind of syllabus, well, he certainly has a recommended reading list. He said you only have to read 2 books to achieve moral perfection, the Bible and Cicero. But many of the books that I quoted from that have the phrase "the pursuit of happiness" were basically 18th century or 17th century self-help manuals like Matthew Hale, which advises people to keep their temper by counting to 10 if they're angry or something like that. Jefferson channeled that advice in his famous list, if angry, count to 10, if very angry, 100. So essentially all of the books of moral philosophy I talked about are essentially self-help manuals, but they're more or less explicit about how precisely to engage in that self-accounting, and an update would be great.
Yeah. I'm flashing back to a scene of standing in my home when I was a boy, and my father, who seldom lost his temper, something was said that sparked his anger, and he immediately began 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, and kept on counting. And I said that somewhere along the way he came across Benjamin Franklin's advice there. Other disciplines that stood out to me, the importance of dialogue, working on gentle persuasion rather than slashing out at another. Unpack that one for us.
Isn't it striking that Franklin, first of all, says he owes all of his success in his life to his conciliating temperament, and then says that he learned early to be moderate in asserting opinions, not to say things like, this is so, but it appears to me, or it may be so. And by avoiding the tendentious assertion of opinion, he was better able to persuade. And he took that spirit to the Constitutional Convention, where he helped create compromise, and his final speech to the convention, an appeal for compromise, is very much in that spirit. It really is striking that the man who tamed the Gulf Stream and brought lightning from the heavens thought that out of everything that he achieved in his life, the most important achievement he had was moderation, conciliation of temperament, and not asserting his opinions too confidently.
Yeah, it reminds me of a professor that when I was in my first year of teaching, he had been teaching 30, 40 years and had finished out his career at Pepperdine. And I was asking him just for some advice on how to talk about matters that are socially, politically, theologically fraught with strong opinions. And he told me that he had discovered long ago that one simple approach that seemed to work quite well was to simply preface anything that he thought would be potentially fraught, to simply say, I may be wrong about this, but it seems to me that. And that is, I've gotten so much mileage out of that bit of wisdom.
That's great advice. I spent 20 years as an overconfident opinion journalist. And the best part of my new job at the National Constitution Center is I'm not allowed to have any opinions at all. And I've also lost interest in my own opinions. And it's very liberating. I highly recommend it.
Oh, that's great. There was an article recently that I didn't read, but I was struck by the title that said something to the effect of, our persistent focus on self-improvement is making us miserable. As I said, I didn't read it, but I suspect that as I myself, who am a recovering perfectionist in certain ways, I get that, that there's, and you talk about John Quincy Adams and the way in which he has a son who tragically dies from suicide, and yet John Quincy Adams is anxiety-ridden or grief-stricken over the possibility that perhaps he put too great expectations upon his son that led to his own depression. How would you respond to that possibility that too great an emphasis upon self-improvement might actually be counterproductive to what we're trying to be and do?
It's an interesting suggestion. But at the same time, of course, the stoic wisdom is designed to prevent us from unproductive self-reproach and to achieve tranquility of mind and soul. That's the goal, the very definition of happiness, which Jefferson loved to quote in a passage from Cicero's Tusculan Disputations that inspired almost all the founders, is the tranquility of mind that's neither unduly exuberant and unduly despondent. It's that Aristotelian mean. So in that sense, if you're practicing the wisdom rigorously, then you wouldn't allow it to induce excessive self-reproach or anxious self-recrimination, which would be unproductive. Ideally, it spurs you on to productive industry, which channels all of that anxiety into productive work. But it's a delicate psychological balance, as Quincy Adams shows, as life is. Moving through the day and using every moment productively, as opposed to getting distracted by these unproductive perseverations, is a daily challenge and is extremely difficult. And the quest never ends. So I don't think that it's right that the quest for self-improvement is what creates anxiety, because if we truly were mastering ourselves and improving our character, then we wouldn't allow ourselves to be distracted by these unproductive ego-based perseverations. But it does remind us why the Stoic wisdom is so extraordinarily difficult to practice in its most rigorous form.
Yeah, I find your response here immensely helpful. A parallel way I've thought about it is that the related virtue here is magnanimity. At least one way of thinking about magnanimity is this sort of commitment to improvement in every part of oneself. And as you said, if you're really committed to that, then this sort of useless, damaging self-reproach itself becomes something that we must get better at. And it can allow us to give ourselves more grace, to give ourselves more self-compassion as we try to grow. So yeah, thank you for that. Very helpful. Another thing that I found quite fascinating is that another yet repeated theme is the way, and you alluded to this a moment ago, is the way in which the founders saw personal self-government as a central aspect of political self-government. So unpack that major theme for us.
It's absolutely central. And remember, this is the first time in human history that they're testing the proposition of whether it's possible for men to govern themselves by reason and conviction rather than force or violence. And the way to test whether we can govern ourselves by reason as a republic is whether we can govern ourselves by reason as individuals. Unless we achieve virtuous self-mastery, moderation, temperance, and all the virtues, we won't defend liberty when it's under siege. We'll trade our liberties for cheap luxuries, as Rome did when it allowed the demagogue Caesar to flatter the people and then to subvert the republic. We won't choose wise leaders and virtuous leaders who themselves show self-restraint and are devoted to the public good rather than self-interest. The main goal is to avoid a Caesar who's overcome by ambition and avarice rather than the public interest. The founders are not sure whether the experiment will succeed. And in fact, at the end of their lives, many are dubious at best and some quite pessimistic because the experiment's never been tried and it's always in danger of failing. Madison, out of all of them, is perhaps the most cautiously optimistic because he expects less from public virtue. If men were angels, no government would be necessary. If without some virtue, government would be impossible. But at the end of his life, Jefferson is completely despondent and thinks that the Union is about to divide over the question of slavery, and he proves to be correct about that prediction. So ultimately, your optimism or pessimism may have much to do with your views of human nature, and those who were more meliorist and had a sense of human perfectibility might have been more optimistic. But it all turns on your faith in the ability of individual citizens to achieve self-government on a broad scale.
One major topic that this raises is the virtue traditions point to fundamentally different conceptions of what we mean by freedom. That is that freedom in this approach, it certainly is going to have a sort of notion of at least some element of kind of libertarian political freedom, but that's not the primary emphasis of it. The primary emphasis of it seems to be the capacity to do what is good, as opposed to the capacity to do what one wants. Would you agree with that or no?
Yes, certainly the classical tradition of freedom is not unregulated autonomy, but right reason, aligning ourselves with the divine harmonies of the universe, and in doing so, fulfilling not only our right, but our duty to use our powers of reason to align with the divine. And we see this throughout the founding era in the Virginia Declaration of Rights, which talks about the freedom of conscience and worship as a duty which we owe to our Creator, to exercise it by reason and conviction, not by force or violence. And therefore, all men are entitled to the unalienable rights of conscience. And we see this in the idea that it's in limits that we, the limitless, explore, as Goethe put it, and the idea throughout much of the 19th century, too, in the Romantic as well as the classical tradition, that it's through self-regulation that we achieve true freedom. I quoted Leonard Bernstein, the great musical teacher and composer, talking about human freedom being the freedom to choose wisely in order to be able to obtain government over ourselves. So for all those reasons, the founders did have a sense that it's in limits that we achieve freedom.
I hear you making the case that the conception of moral formation, the moral philosophy we've been discussing, was seen as parallel to political practice. So where does all of this work on the founders and American history leave you today? What are your hopes? What are your frustrations? We seem to be at a very different place now, obviously, in our thinking about education, our thinking about morality. Where does this leave you today with the state of contemporary politics and contemporary socio-political concerns?
In many ways, we're living in the founders' nightmare. They warned of demagogues, of rule by passion rather than reason, of the need to check our immediate and lowest impulses, and a world of social media and political polarization in many ways seems to be the opposite. It does remind us of the urgent need for civic education. The founders thought that the antidote to this sort of rule by passion is deep reading in American history and politics and philosophy that would allow citizens to muster the virtuous self-regulation that could save the republic. This is a time when reading itself is under siege, and the distractions of social media have ensured that even the best educated among us have lost the habit of actually reading books. For me, having lost that habit myself, rediscovering it during COVID was incredibly empowering, and it just blows my mind that all the books in the world are online and that we can carry them around on our iPhones, and that all we need is the self-discipline to read them. So I've become an evangelist for the radically liberating and empowering habits of deep reading and just setting aside a few hours a day, or an hour or a half hour, but some real time to actually read books rather than browsing. And if enough citizens rediscover this transformative power, perhaps the Republic can be saved.
Been talking to Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, about his new book, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. Jeff, thanks so much for your book and your work and for the great conversation today.
Thank you for a wonderful conversation. I enjoyed it greatly.
You've been listening to No Small Endeavor and our interview with Jeffrey Rosen, President and CEO of the National Constitution Center, on his book, The Pursuit of Happiness: How Classical Writers on Virtue Inspired the Lives of the Founders and Defined America. You can hear more of Jeffrey on his podcast, We the People, a podcast of weekly constitutional debate. We gratefully acknowledge the support of Lilly Endowment Incorporated, a private philanthropic foundation supporting the causes of community development, education, and religion, and the support of the John Templeton Foundation, whose vision is to become a global catalyst for discoveries that contribute to human flourishing. Our thanks to all the stellar team that makes this show possible: Christy Bragg, Jacob Lewis, Sophie Byard, Tom Anderson, Kate Hayes, Mary Evelyn Brown, Carriot Harmon, Jason Sheasley, Ellis Osborne, and Tim Lauer. Thanks for listening, and let's keep exploring what it means to live a good life together. No Small Endeavor is a production of PRX, Tokens Media LLC, and
Great Feeling Studio.